Okay, so let's begin with a couple of the background pieces of data that many of us in this room are well aware of. And this graph, and it could be a graph about any scientific career progression, whether it is in engineering professions, whether it is in research, whether it is in academia. What we see, and I think I just have to manage the pointer, what we see here is this is the proportion of men and women who are at each stage of a scientific career here from OECD data, going through undergraduate, graduates in postgraduate terms, moving through scientific grades to the highest level. It will not surprise you to know that the squares here are men, the proportion of men at each level in that career progression, and as seniority occurs and you go up the career grade in this progression, so the proportion of men increase. And of course, correspondingly, whilst we start with more women in the early years of science, particularly at undergraduate levels and through equality at doctoral levels, then we see progressively this fall. This came from a very good book, Women in Science and Scientific Careers. It's an excellent book because it takes a look at this scissor diagram, that growing gap between the proportion of men and women in senior roles across a number of different cultures in the OECD, and reflects on where this gap is a little narrower or where it's wider and the factors that might contribute. The two lines simply reflect what has occurred in the first line between 1999 and then 4 years later, 2003. And what you can see is there isn't much progression across that window, nor indeed subsequently. So this is a very classic scissor diagram and can be mirrored across particularly academic institutions. It would be true of Australia, certainly in terms of professorial positions, the proportion held would currently be around 20%. So not only are there differences in progression, there are also other known elements, such as at each salary grade, one has a difference in salary gap between both women and men in most studies carried out. So without rehearsing all of the background data, but using that as a sort of template, what one looks to is the analysis rather of the myriad of studies repeating the same findings to solutions. What is it that can be identified lying behind such data in different cultures that can then be addressed through either interventions or indeed in an evolutionary way? Really, in summarising a great deal of literature, there are two key points to be made. There are clear structural factors in organisations and in the societal pressures that women face, and the structural factors contribute to a particularly leaky pipeline. That is, the lower proportion of women that come through to senior levels reflect that women drop out of scientific careers at different stages along a pipeline. So there is a leaky pipeline, and the structural factors that contribute to that can include employment conditions, and known to many of you here, the delay in entering research careers, working on temporary work contracts, therefore on a part-time basis, and organisational attitudes to family-work balance, and indeed individual attitudes to family-work balance. And what we'll see tomorrow's session, session 2, will particularly focus on this structural issue, how to juggle that family-work balance. And so reasonably, those structural features are absolutely key, and we recognise that. But in today's session, we're unpacking a piece of this series of discussions which are about the women who stay in the pipeline, but what are the barriers to their progression within the pipeline. So there are factors which promote a leakiness in the pipeline, and then there are barriers to progression within it. The issues identified in the OECD report discuss a number of pertinent points for us today. Firstly, what's been called a sort of science excellence gap. Reports in the literature and evidence that there's a gendered system for the evaluation of scientific excellence that can impact on career advancement, the lack of participation of women in particular in the setting of research agendas. And I think we're going to flow some of that through in the current discussion. There are some striking pieces of work in the literature. There are also some striking responses to this in a large number of scientific funding agencies and in organisations such as universities. So there is a barrier to progression in relation to what's perceived in terms of women's work and the quality of that work when compared to work from male scientists. Clearly, if one comes into the career later, there will be a research productivity gap, and there'll be a mismatch between a seniority, as it were, in terms of one's scientific career and in terms of one's maturity as a professional leader. And so you get a gap in being able to take up team leader positions at the level of productivity that's been, in a sense, in a slightly time-lagged frame because of perhaps other commitments, including family. But what we would like to discuss today is something more around the career management gap. And this comes into one of the barriers that was highlighted in this report, not only lack of leadership role models, because they're not there in large part, given that scissor diagram, and the relationship to that with the lack of mentors in the workplace. And so this is the premise of today's discussion around mentorship and the importance of mentorship. And I just want to very briefly take the results of a study carried in an environment outside of science and in business. And this is around high potential women and their success. And the Harvard Business Review carries some very interesting reviews on the progress of women through stages of career. In this study, 4,000 men and women graduates from top MBA programs were surveyed in 2008. Women were paid less, they had significantly less career satisfaction, but despite those two negatives, they actually had more mentorship, which brings a mismatch. How useful is mentorship when this is the outcome? In 2010, in a follow-up study, it was found out of the original 2008 study, men had received 15% more promotions than women, and mentorship was a significant predictor of promotion, but only for men and not for women. So this was unpacked by the authors, and it sets a framework for today, which is that not all mentorship that women scientists or women in career progressions undergo may be of equal value. And the authors unpacked mentorship versus sponsorship. The study found that the more senior a mentor, the faster the mentee's career advanced, and men tended to have more senior mentors. Some mentors have more organisational clout because of their seniority, and the authors proposed that they were more able to sponsor in an active way, therefore, the mentee in the organisation. And this produced an interesting discussion of whether mentors who give great, insightful, reflective advice are not actually perhaps the high flyers in the organisation with the influence or sponsorship to pull people up through the system. So the authors suggest a particular form of mentorship which goes beyond giving feedback and advice, where the mentor uses influence with senior leadership to advocate. So politically astute public endorsement of mentees' capability. And this seemed to be the features of mentorship which the male senior people were experiencing versus in the instance of the females. And so this led to the question, are women over-mentored? Many women in that study had intensive and extensive mentorship, but under-sponsored. And what would a sponsorship program look like? What different features would it have in relation to the classic mentorship programs that are available in many institutions, to make sure that indeed the activation of sponsorship brought about the intent of these programs, which is to ensure individuals arrive at their career potential. So I'm just going to flick to the end because of time, and to say this session therefore wants to open up. Are we, in Women in Science, are we over-mentored and under-sponsored? Can we identify the features of programs that might more actively have the end result required, perhaps not quite with the empathic mentor, but more with the senior sponsorship, very deliberately bringing about a pool of women through the system in a very straightforward way that appears to typify, in that particular study, how men were mentored. So that introduces a whole series of questions to this barrier for career progression, because we adhere to mentorship as one of those key planks organisationally. But what can we do to improve organisations' mentorship programs to make them reflect perhaps more active sponsorship? So what we thought today is we'd go through a series of questions to unpack that, see if there's any resonance, see if there are any issues that people would bring to the table and what's required in a sponsorship program. Because at the end of this session, reasonably, institutionally, we have to take away the message of who is doing this well, what are the results, and do we need to put women through intensive mentorship if it doesn't have the outcomes of closing that gap in the scissor diagram. So just to emphasise, other structural issues in juggling life and work and career balance, also in terms of the glass ceiling and the labyrinth that is often a woman's career, will be really unpacked in the next two sessions in this series as well. So without more ado, what I want to do is now go across to the panel and begin the questions, and we would like this to be interactive. We'd like to hear from you, and we'd like to hear where you disagree and where you agree and want to add value, because this will be hopefully harnessed in an outcome as a written report, which actually will then, against the literature, be able to move things forwards. So women physiologists will prevail. Okay, let's come to Abby. Let's ask, what key experiences of mentorship or sponsorship, in that continuum, as it were, have made a difference to your career progression? And then we'll just go down our line and come back to Patricia.
I've worked in Cambridge my entire career, and during that time I've had one very formative mentor. She was a very senior lady in the department when I was doing my PhD. She had been entirely research-based for her career on short-term contracts. She was not a member of the teaching staff, so she didn't have to give lectures or demonstrate or, in fact, do any administrative work that was associated with teaching or running of the department. But what she was an extremely able physiologist. And what's more, she had 4 children. And at that stage, it was quite unusual to find married women in the field, let alone with 4 children. And she taught me 3 real things. She taught me practically how to do the things that I needed to do to be able to pursue the research that I do, which is in sort of fetal and placental physiology, using whole animals for experimental studies. She also taught me how to write. And she used to really go through everything I wrote with a red pen, time and time again. And it was the days before word processing, so it was all done on paper. And she would tirelessly go through everything I wrote to the stage that I got that I could write like she wrote. So I was then able to actually progress my scientific career pretty rapidly because I had 2 of the key skills. One was the experimental skills and one was the writing skills. The other thing she did as a mentor was to show me that it was perfectly possible to do this whilst having a family. And because her children at that stage were teenagers, into their early 20s, those children had survived. She'd done all sorts of crazy things. She'd taken them to some meetings, she'd put them in cupboards while she'd made her speeches at meetings. And you know, her children were fine. You know, they were perfectly well-adjusted adults. It was also at the stage where, in fact, there were beginning to be more openings for women. It was in the early 70s when I was doing this. The Female Eunuch had just been published. Germaine Greer was actually a research fellow in the college that I was in. So there was a lot of interest, a lot of pressure on women to think they could do everything. And she was a fantastic mentor from that point. I had two sponsors. One was my PhD supervisor, who was a very senior male, and he took a risk in saying to the department, when they had a temporary position as a demonstrator available, to give me a try. This was before I'd actually finished my PhD, so I was in a teaching role, I was demonstrating, I was lecturing, and I was finishing my PhD. But it was temporary, so if I failed, it didn't really matter. I could go. But having been given that opportunity and taken that risk, when a proper demonstratorship came up, I was poised. I could do this. And the department didn't look very good because it had no women on its teaching staff at all at that point. And he was very, very good at obviously acting as a sponsor, convincing the head of department that this was a useful thing to do. The second sponsor was much later in the career, when in fact what we needed was more research infrastructure in terms of requiring a new animal house. And he was very, very good at accepting that the research was good, that we did need the infrastructure, and poured in the money to make sure that we could continue. So the sponsors were very different. One was a career-orientated sponsor, and one was, if you like, an infrastructural sponsor that made sure that the facilities were there for allowing me to do my research.
Thank you. Lisa.
Hello, everyone. So I'm an early career researcher from Australia, and I've actually just recently finished my PhD. And so I've been very fortunate, I think, throughout the course of my PhD, because my PhD supervisor was none other than Caroline. So I only have good things to say. Here. Biased opinion. So starting off with sponsorship. So when I decided to do a PhD, I took a couple of years break after I'd finished my undergraduate degree before I decided about what I wanted to do next. And when I did decide to do a PhD, an honours and then a PhD, I actually specifically sought out Caroline because I had been in a few of her lectures during my undergraduate time. And I knew the sort of work she was involved in, and more importantly, I knew the sort of woman she was or is, and the type of scientist that she is. So we sat down, had a chat, and she was happy to have me as a student. So I was happy about that. And throughout the entire time of my PhD, and even continuing on from that, Caroline has been a great mentor, because similar to what Abby said earlier about her mentor, she did teach me about what it means to be a good scientist in terms of getting the science right and getting it good and doing it well. The animal experimentation, the laboratory work, all of that. And she also did teach me a lot about how to write science well, and she did go through my work. And so I'm very grateful for that, because I feel more confident now, having come out of that PhD, that, I've learned these two very valuable skills. Caroline and the lab have also given me various opportunities to present at conferences overseas. This will be my fourth overseas conference in a very short time. So I've been very, very lucky, because I've been exposed to the research community very early on in my PhD. And Caroline also gave me the opportunity to carry out some work at the University of Cambridge about 6 months into my PhD. So that was also, she threw me into the deep end, and I'm glad I survived, and I hope I thrived. So that was really great, because, she gave me the opportunity to push myself and see how far I could go. And she is also really good at sponsorship and sponsoring me, because, this is a clear example of that. And also all the opportunities to meet people, and she's always by my side, introducing me to key people and all that sort of thing. So I think that's really been important. But in terms of the man versus female versus male. I can't say I've really experienced any. I haven't experienced any bias in terms of that. I don't feel that I get more or less because I'm female versus being male. But maybe we can come back to that issue later.
Barbara.
When I think back on sponsorship, mentorship and so on, it's such a long time ago now. The concepts weren't invented in those days. And when I think back to my bachelor's degree, which I did in London, then I see that my professor there was very supportive, and I suppose one would say this was a type of sponsorship because he recommended me for a scholarship that then took me to Stockholm, and that's where I did my PhD, and I never got away from there. It's now 45 years ago on a 9-month scholarship from London University. So this was the first type of, as we define it now then, sponsorship. Then my PhD supervisor, he was dean of the faculty, he was a very senior person, and certainly in retrospect I would say he sponsored me, although at the time he was merely supportive. So it starts to become difficult how you define sponsorship, because this was an indirect type of support. It wasn't anything that was defined, and it was based on the fact that we liked one another very much, and he trusted me and supported me. And I think it's difficult to see how sponsorship can work if it's organised too much, because you have to believe in the person you're going to sponsor. And I think this is extremely important. And therefore I can't see that you can do it by just saying A has to sponsor B or something like this. I think in another aspect, if I can take this up, and that is the fact that I also had a lot of support at home, because my husband and I have shared a lab for almost 40 years, and he took just as much parenthood leave as I did. I was dean when we had our second kid. We used to walk into work with him in the winter in Sweden, and he'd fall asleep, so we used to put him in the cold room rather than wake him up. As Abby said, they turned out all right. But as my husband usually says, you can't do the control experiment. So I think that the situation for women is complex, because I'm very afraid of making things worse by doing too much organised sponsorship, which then would undermine a natural progression, which I keep hoping is going to happen, but which, according to the scissors diagram, isn't. Although I still, anyway, would say that when I started my PhD, I was one of very, very few women. And we're now 25-30% of professors at Stockholm University are women. So things have changed during my career, but it's slow.
So thank you. Now, Patricia.
I would like to talk a little bit about my experience in the University of São Paulo. Thinking about mentorship, I can say that I had two mentors in my career that were very supportive. We don't have actually in the University of São Paulo a formal mentorship and sponsorship program. So everything is like informal. So what I can see and I can tell about my experience is that they were supportive. They were very they liked my work. They were helping me to teach and think in science, how to write papers, very formal work with science and think about science. But I do remember as well, as a young scientist at that time, that I was told, but if you want to succeed in your career, forget about getting married and having kids. So that had an impact in my career, because I didn't hear them, fortunately, at that part. And but I got my first and single kid very late in my career, and I would like that my story could be different because of that, because I was afraid of failing in my career, the failure if I had kids. So about sponsorship, that I can say I was sponsored, because they were helping me, but very supportive, informal, to be in bank committees, PhD thesis defenses, to give talks in scientific meetings in Brazil. And that is a kind of sponsorship, if you think about an informal sponsorship. So if I think about that, I had some sponsorship, mentorship, but we still have problems in University of São Paulo, and I think nowadays with this imbalance between women and men at the University of São Paulo. In my program, we have 60% women PhD students and 40% are men. But when you look at the University of São Paulo numbers, we have 5,800 faculty members, but only 37% are women. What's going on then about with mentorship and sponsorship? So this is a brief talk about my experience. Thank you.
Thank you. I just would like to ask the early career researchers in the room if you could put up your hand if you've just in the last year received a grant. Fabulous. I think for every person who's put their hand up, there's been a sponsor. Somebody at some table at some time had to speak for that grant. And their decision to do so, particularly at an early career stage, often has to be quite a deliberate one, because there's sometimes not a lot to differentiate us when we're at an early career stage from our colleagues. And I do think that one of the most impressive, and by sponsorship here, I simply mean speaking up for a proposal that is a good proposal amidst many good proposals. And I do recall my very first grant, and I still think that without that first break, that very first grant, it's very difficult to progress. And having chaired innumerable grant panels now, it's the ability for somebody to speak up for that grant and really back the track record, the individual, the environment they're in. So I think sometimes there are very generous people around panels, and there are not so generous people around panels. And I think for early career researchers, we do need to have generous sponsors, actually. So thank you. Any comments from the floor about mentorship and sponsorship is an artificial division? Please, if you've got a lovely loud voice, or if you'd like to come to the microphone.
Hello, my name is Christina Karadzaferi. I'm from Greece. I raised my hand because I indeed had a good grant last year. And I found out later from a person who said that I was in that panel, and because I have talked to you in conferences, because you were there and you presented very well, you persuaded me that you knew what you were doing. So this person, a male professor, was following my career. I didn't know that. He liked the type of work I was doing. And then he happened to be in that panel. And a year later, after I had the success, I found him in a conference, and he told me that. So I think it's very important that we keep presenting our work on ourselves as best as we can, every time, in its opportunity.
Thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful example of mentorship to ensure you're supported to go to a meeting, And the consequences of that is it allows a senior scientist to sponsor a proposal in a competitive field because they have confidence in the work and in the individual. And seeing both parts of that equation are very important. The mentorship to get there, the sponsorship, which is derived from your own capacity to carry the scientific audience with a quality of work and presentation. That takes us perhaps on to the next piece, which are women scientists actually over-mentored and under-sponsored? We might need to come on to the next piece relatively quickly. But Patricia, would you like to take that discussion further?
Let's start with Abby and see about what do you think about.
I think it's a very difficult issue. I think the more people you can talk to about career structures and where you're going, whether you define that as mentoring or not, I don't know, but the more people you talk to, the more different sorts of career pathways you can find out about, the more likely you are to succeed or find a route that actually fits your own particular circumstances. Whether you define that as being over-mentored, I don't think in an academic career track that probably is the case. It may be if you had multiple mentors in a business sense and you weren't getting on with whatever you needed to do for the company because you've got very precise goals, maybe that would be the case. Under sponsorship, I think, comes back to what Barbara was saying. It's something that is unique between the sponsor and the individual, and it's a sort of personal relationship, and the only way you're going to be sponsored is by being good at what you do. And you have to do good science and be recognised for doing good science. And the recognition comes, as was already mentioned, by going to meetings, presenting it, talking to people, engaging with the community at large, whoever they are.
Lisa?
Well, in relation to that second question about being over-mentored and under-sponsored, well, from an early career or point of view, I think in general, at least the PhD students that I know and talk to, because I'm quite involved in the postgraduate forum and stuff at the University of South Australia, and a couple of other committees, and so I interact quite a bit with especially PhD students at various stages of their PhD, and I think in general that there is not enough mentoring and sponsorship going on. I don't know if the other students that are in this room, if they agree with me, but like I said, I was fortunate to have a very good mentor and a sponsor. And if I compare that experience with some of the other people that I've met and talked to that haven't had that experience, they approach their PhD very differently. They approach their research career post their PhD very differently, and with a different kind of drive and positivity that is not actually related to that individual's character, but actually just because they haven't received enough, or if not even any mentoring and sponsorship, and what sort of options are available to them whilst they're doing the PhD, and what sort of options are available to them just after, and what they should be looking out for, what they should be pushing for. I think that is severely lacking. In general, at least from my point of view, for whether or not you're male or female, I think it may be a bit different when that whole scissor effect starts to happen in maybe in mid-career, but at least from an early career point of view, that's my opinion. Barbara?
And Barbara?
I think probably, as we've heard, the most important thing is networking, which is in a way a type of developing sponsorship. You need a network of people who are in more senior positions, and not necessarily at your own university, but also who are going to notice you if you speak at a conference, and then who happen to be, as we heard, sitting in the committee that decides who's going to get a grant when the granting agency is only funding 8% of the applicants, and so there's a great deal of stochastic chance involved in whether you're going to be supported, however good you are. And as we've heard, if you happen to be someone who's been noticed somewhere, then you have a much higher chance of actually being supported. I think that we need to support, as Lisa was saying, both men and women when they finish their PhDs. We have courses in Stockholm after the PhD and so on, and we need to be able to support people to go abroad and do postdocs and find primarily a very good place to go to, and this is dependent on us as senior scientists having contact with other senior scientists where some good lab is prepared to take you, whoever you are. As long as you're good, you'll get a position as a postdoc, but it should be carefully thought through who you go to, and is this going to be a career step which is going to be very helpful.
I'd just like to add to that, just to come back to that point about having access to conferences. I mean, you know, I'm from Australia, so as you can imagine, it costs a lot of money, and it is a long way to come to go to Europe and America, which is where the big conferences happen. So, you know, I've been lucky because, you know, I've had that opportunity, but most people don't. You know, they're lucky if they attend one international conference throughout the course of their PhD. So that, because of maybe that lack of mentorship or their supervisors going, okay, hey, look, you know, I'm going to send you to, you know, at least one big good one, and we're going to see what we can do and who we can meet at this conference. I think that's really, really, really important, as Barbara has just reiterated. So.
And Carolina?
I think I'll take a good contrary point of view. I actually think that where particularly there are issues about, firstly, the seniority of mentors. More women have less senior mentors, and that's what the evidence shows. So I think the criticality is to make sure, as a mentor, your mentor has that seniority. That means they understand the global academy of science and how and in what way you can proceed in it. If your mentor has not been engaged at that level, then it is difficult for them, I think, to effectively mentor. The other piece is, I do think that science is gendered. And I think that it is as gendered as is life, which means that sometimes being aware of the gendered nature of leadership is helpful both for male and female sponsors. So I actually think that some of the recommendations that have come out of this notion of sponsorship is that both male and female sponsors could understand a little more about the gendered nature of leadership. That is, for instance, how women and men are perceived around committee tables, how your actions as leaders are perceived from a gendered basis. And I raise this because it's often not raised, but I think it is critical. So we know that, and all of the literature tells us, that assertive leadership in women is not well regarded. If I had $1 for every time a very good female researcher is described as high maintenance, I would be quite well off as a vice-chancellor. I have yet to find any of my tremendous, excellent male researchers in the university being described as such. They are ambitious and passionate. So reasonably, what I would say is being aware of the gendered nature of leadership. There's a terrific article which basically says if you're assertive, that doesn't go down well. If you're unassertive, it's viewed as really rather wussy. It's Australian for not very effective. So I'm not too sure where we land in the middle of our leadership style. But I do think that whilst excellence is the key threshold, it is necessary, but it is not sufficient to help us navigate the career progression. So I just opened that up just to put a small additional element into the mix. Has anyone any comment on, perhaps it moves into our third question, I think, which is there a need for an institutional approach, Or is this, as is argued very appropriately, should be done at an individual base? Because sometimes I do get concerned that if we leave it to the individuals, we will, I think our individual approaches has delivered individual benefit, but it has resulted in the scissor diagram. We may need an institutional approach. But what would you like to say about that? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Elena Aiko. I'm from Harvard, Boston, Massachusetts. Actually, before moving forward, I have a question to panelists and to you. How do you define sponsorship, mentorship, and supervisorship? I think this is three very important criteria which we kind of need to separate. And while I'm here, I just want to let everybody know that I have open position in my lab. So this is about networking.
Perhaps, Abby, would you like to reflect on the continuum or gradient that is mentorship to sponsorship and supervision?
I suppose I'd start with supervision, because I would see if you're really a good supervisor, you should end up sort of partly disagreeing with the person you're supervising, because you want that to end up as their ideas, not your ideas, and there will always be an element of conflict, if you like, in developing that role. That's what you should be doing, or challenging them. Mentoring, I think, is very much more sort of supportive, trying to give ideas how to sort out problems that may have arisen along the way, what's your experience of certain things, and not something that's necessarily has an element of conflict in it. Sponsorship, I think, is very much more of a proactive thing. You're there because you think that this person is excellent and you want to see them progress. And it's a question then of finding the right way within a committee structure to ensure, to a certain extent, that your views prevail against other people in the committee who will have their own particular candidates they're sponsoring. So that is more of a sort of adversary role between sponsors, to a certain extent, in terms of trying to make sure that you put your particular person that you want to sponsor or see progress in the best possible light, given what the recruitment profile is for the particular promotion or position that you're talking about.
Thank you. We have a question here, and then one at the back. So, yeah, please. Thank you.
I think I'll turn around this way. My name is Professor Lee Delbridge. I'm from the University of Melbourne in Australia, so we seem to have a representation from Australia. I'm the first woman to be appointed professor at the University of Melbourne, which just celebrated 150 years of its existence, which is not very many years considering here. And that in itself is scandalous, because there have been very many wonderful women who have preceded me in my department and not been appointed as professors. I would like to take Caroline's point a little bit further and say when it comes down to tin tacks, almost every promotion is evaluated on the basis of publication. And in physiology and in science, I think that's pretty much the case. If anybody would like to disagree with me, that's fine. I think that a good mentor is somebody to debrief with and give you strategic personal advice, but a sponsor is somebody who is going to get your name on papers and going to set up collaborations for you, be in the background, propose the linkages, be on grant panels, and have a quiet word to say and produce a bit of arithmetic about publication output relative to opportunity and say exactly how it's scaled. And I know that there have been women in Australia who have done that for me, just quietly, and they have not identified themselves to me, I'm sure, but there are people there who have done it, and I think getting names on papers is the single most important sponsorship activity that I think that we can do for each other.
Thank you very much. And we also had a question here. Thank you very much.
It's not a question, but rather a remark. I'm Sylvie Lorsois from France. I'm a researcher at the National Centre of Scientific Research. And I think networking is very important, and conferences are not necessarily the best places, to my opinion. I think it's very important to choose the PhD Defense Committee, and also in some countries there are habilitation committees later. And having very knowledgeable and influential people in your field is very important, because they make the effort to come and to listen to you during 1 hour almost, to give their advice, and then when they write a recommendation, it's a real serious recommendation, and it can open doors. And for me, it was very efficient.
Terrific. And we have a great number of questions right at the back. Thank you first. Yes, we have two at the back. That's fine.
I am Aino Adeogun from Nigeria. I have a comment, and it goes with the women that are the senior faculty members all over the world. That since we realize that these problems are there for women, is it possible for women faculty members, senior ones, to begin to open their hearts and their labs more to younger women that are coming up? I have a personal experience. I wanted to do some work, and I wrote a senior scientist somewhere in the United States, and I've written a number of times, there's been no response. That happens to a lot of us too. A lot of women want to come to these meetings and all. For example, where I come from, most of us had to do self-sponsoring. I've been to 2 meetings this year, one in the US and here, and we have to sponsor ourselves. So it's difficult to come to these meetings. But as women, since we realize what these problems are, can we be a bit more friendly? We talk about the men, most of the women that have spoken here have talked about men sponsors. How many women sponsors do we have? I know that as women, we have this intrinsic thing to be a bit more cautious and a bit more careful. But can we begin to think of how we as women can help one another, and let the senior ones help us up, and be more open with their labs and their hearts, so that at least we can all pull one another up, and then get there and be able to do a better network for women that are coming after us.
Thank you very much indeed for that great point. Now we'll take this question. If we could have 3 people behind the microphone, because we'll be coming to the end of the session. So we've got one here, and that's our 3. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ute Becher. I'm coming from Germany. And there's one thing in Germany that is there. In every committee there has to be a woman to supervise that everything goes well. And due to that, I got on some committees for appointing position, and I'd just like to comment on the way women are perceived by the community for how they have how they get positions and so on. And being on these committees is really, really helpful. So if you like to get a position, try to get on committees to really see how you're perceived and how your presentation is perceived, because there are quite a different ways of presenting yourselves, and women are often perceived completely different as males are, and this is really helpful.
Thank you. Again, that gendered nature of the journey.
Tatiana Kostraminova, Indiana University Medical School, United States. It looks like this problem exists for a long time for underrepresented senior members of the scientific community, being females, and the question is, what is their background for that? So it's historical, first of all, and it takes time to change that. It's gradually changing, so it's much better than it was, let's say, 100 years ago, where women were not allowed to be students at the university. At some universities, it's getting better, but still, this senior sponsorship and mentorship for females lacking. Are there any studies that investigated this problem and found out what is the reason for that? Because unless we understand what is the reason, we can't change it. And if we could have some questionnaires to senior people, yes, male and females, which would be anonymous, so they wouldn't have to identify, yes, themselves and be kind of thinking, if I say that, they will think something about me. So it would be anonymous, so they, yes, could tell the truth, so we could know a little bit more about the reason why this is happening.
I think as scientists we love a good evidence base. And I think one of the interesting pieces in that study of 4,000 people was unpacking something that was different in mentorship, identifying the elements of it, and then seeing what they tracked with and where they weren't confounded. Whether that translates into science is really something, given that most institutions run mentorship programs for high potential women, it is worthwhile envisaging how we unpack the key elements that are seen to be key for the difference between empathic mentorship but not effective versus active sponsorship that might be. So I think that's a very important piece. Question.
My name is Heather Heldum from the University of South Florida in the U.S. And I guess I have something to sort of follow up on this study that you've brought up. And I found it very helpful to listen to this because I felt like I didn't know necessarily what some of the barriers were for women or why there was this career sort of dropout over time. But I do think there are sort of two sides to every coin. On the first hand, it's very important, of course, for institutions to combat any kind of sort of latent sexism and try to combat those attitudes and at least be aware of different perceptions of men and women, especially among people who are on these selection committees. But on the other side of the coin, I feel like one of the things that I've taken away from this that's been very helpful to me is the idea of choosing a mentor not just based on whether or not their research matches yours and whether or not they're somebody you feel like you can work well with, which is what I feel like most of us look for going forward, but also starting to think about, is this person in a senior position either within this organization or, you know, are they well known with the granting organization, and starting to think more strategically, which is something that honestly, I think this is the first meeting where I've ever heard that sort of verbalized, that idea that you need somebody who has the clout, who is going to sponsor you well, who will take an active role in promoting you. Because especially listening to the grad students around me as they, you know, select their PIs, most of what people are focused on is the interpersonal relationship and the scientific project. And I think one of the things that's very important that I've learned today is that that may not be enough. You need that third piece, that active role in sponsoring you outside of your own lab in order to help move your career forward. And I think that's something that all of us can maybe do. I see a number of other young career people like myself, so hopefully we can all kind of take that and move on with that and start to seek out better mentorship. With regards to the study you've brought up, I'd be very curious to know if they were able to determine the reasons that women ended up in mentoring relationships rather than sponsored relationships.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that very cogent summary. We have 4 minutes and perhaps a minute each on what key element would you include in the University of Utopia's sponsorship program with 50% everything, no scissor diagram at all. What is the one element in a sponsorship or mentorship program you would include to ensure? And I'm going to start with Patricia.
Actually, would you explain exactly what you meant by the problem?
So if you had one thing that you put into a program to support female physiologist scientists that would be part of a program that was actively ensuring their career progression through mentorship or sponsorship, you have a pause and think.
And yeah, actually, what I think about it, if I think in my university, we don't have this formal sponsorship or mentorship. So we have started the career progression based on evaluation of CVs last year. So we had only examinations for becoming like from associate to assistant to associate professor based on examination, thesis, defense, and publications, but not evaluation of CVs. That's just started last year. So it's difficult for me to give advice in how it's going to be to differentiate and to see what advices I would give to have this sponsorship and mentorship formalized by women, even if we don't have it formally. And we have started last year with that. So
having a good beginning.
I think it's much more reflective for me to bring back to my country and talk about it and start and have a good start. Brilliant. Instead of giving advice at this point.
Really good. Okay. Thank you for that. Barbara.
I think what I would ask our Vice-Chancellor to put in would be money.
Nobody ever asked Vice-Chancellors.
No, but even fairly low amounts of money could be used to send women scientists to conferences and so on, and I think that would be a good start in something like this, just to keep it short.
Thank you.
Can I just comment? That's exactly what the University of Cambridge has just done. At the end of August, it's starting a scheme for every woman who returns from maternity leave, postdoctoral or academic staff. A sum of money will be made available to be freely used by them for whatever they feel will support them in their career in transition back to being in work full time. So this sum of money may be between £10,000 and £20,000, and it can buy out your teaching or sponsor you to go to meetings or provide childcare so you can take your child to meetings, or it can buy you some form of research assistance for the period in which you're transitioning back to work, say 1 day a week of technical assistance time. So this is what the university has identified as being the most likely thing to try and stop that leaky pipeline just at the point at which women really are seriously trying to balance a whole new set of multiple challenges on their time.
The last word to an early career researcher.
Just very quickly, I think what I would incorporate is, first for all the new female PhD students that start at any university, you tell them you have access to this program. This is what is available for you for support. And I think in terms of the program itself, I think it will be important to not only see very, very senior scientists, whether they be male or female, but also I think it will be important to have access to female researchers that are at various stages of their, from probably mid-career or from that onwards, so that because I think at different stages of your career you go through different struggles and are faced with different issues, and it will be good to have access to sort of all the whole spectrum, so to speak. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Look, thank you indeed. That was a great session. There was a lot of good contribution. I could see faces nodding and reflecting. I think we'll all come out of it with something a bit different. But I think moving on from a view of what constitutes effective mentorship, the evidence base for that, and something that will address the evolutionary incremental change in the scissor diagram is something we can all support. I look forward to seeing you at the next 2 sessions tomorrow and Thursday as part of this series. Thank you all. Thank you very much.